Problem is, I now can't see anyone else.
Oh, sorry.
It'll be cool. It's fine. Right. Whenever you're ready. Really?
Right. Well,
Is everyone
everyone here?
Yeah, I think enough.
Okay, let's get going then. So I'm David McCarthy. I've only been in lab about a year, having taken up brewing during lockdown, being unable to get hold of any at a point in time, and fairly early on, I got myself an iSpindel. I should say, actually, before I start, a huge thanks to both Peter Simons and Jerome for giving up some of their time to share their experiences with me. They're both very experienced brewers, and obviously their experiences were really, really helpful. So shout out to them. And because this is as much curation as a sharing of my own experiences, it will be non-definitive. So the usual provisos, there might be some big gaps in the message, or some additional experiences that they want to share. So do feel free, guys, if you want to add additional input. Okay, let's get into it then. So we're going to go through the iSpindel, what it is and where it fits in the market, the kind of roots of where it's come from, the bits that make it up, and then we'll talk about how it works, and then what you can do with it. How do you, what other services can you talk to? And then the sort of so what question at the end, which is, does it make better beer? You're happy to, thanks. So it's a digital hydrometer. I've realised that I'm talking to a bunch of brewers that a large many of you will have this, but I'll make no assumptions about what you already know, if that's okay. It's a digital hydrometer and thermometer. It uses commonly available components linked together, so all of the boards are very cheap and highly available. It's a very simple build, and we'll show you that later. It's cheap, so in the sort of £30 ballpark, but it's a smart device. It's a Wi-Fi access point. It can talk to other devices, and it's programmable. So the code on it is open source. All of the stuff that makes the iSpindel work was a little project that one guy took on, and other people have got involved, including obviously some of the connecting services such as BrewPilot and Ubidots and all of these other services. So, there's kind of a community of people driving the product. Okay, Darren, thanks. There are other digital hydrometers out there. There might even be more than that 3 when I started writing this about a month ago. The Tilt was the first on the market and the most well known. 2 people from Tilt left Tilt to form Float, and so they have built the Floats as well. But the iSpindel's kind of come out of the DIY maker community, really. It's not a commercial product. So when you look at the comparison at the top, it's much cheaper because it's kind of DIY, but it's the same componentry, effectively. The Tilt and the Float are commercial products, so you get support, you can send it back. There's a helpline, but also there's a kind of software roadmap. So they have a website, they have dashboards, all available to you as an owner when you buy the product. You don't get the support with iSpindel, but you've kind of got the community. So people will help you. Equally, because this has come out of a community of people who are kind of doing it for themselves, the eBay sellers tend to be home brewers also. So I've bought a spindle and built one spindle, and the person I bought it off, I actually had a dry joint in the one I had, and it didn't work. So I contacted the eBay seller, and he made time and helped me kind of troubleshoot it. And yeah, it was no problem. So just to be aware that it's not commercial. So you are, you're building your own stuff. Okay. As I mentioned, Tilt was around first, and a couple of the guys went off to form Floats. But this whole technology stack has come out the back of the kind of maker hackerspace community that really flourished on the back of devices such as the Arduino and Raspberry Pi and MCU devices coming out. They're basically microcontrollers that are Wi-Fi access points that you can program from a PC. So they're super flexible. Because they're so tiny and such low power, they're perfect for secreting places. So, I mean, I guess that's the ultimate use case for the iSpindel, is you can put it inside a fermenter and it can report what's going on inside the vessel. But additionally, they've kind of spawned out into all sorts of Internet of Things products, such as home controllers, and you can control your heating from these kind of devices. You can control your lighting, individual sockets, and also a whole bunches of remote devices. And Internet of Things is so pervasive now, it's no longer something that people kind of highlight as a technology. But having a small low power device thinking and speaking to the outside world is definitely a trend that was born out on the back of the availability of this technology. So, okay. Right, so what makes it up? Well, I've kind of done a block schematic. I mean, obviously it's battery powered because it's standalone. It has a little charger board that allows you to make it a rechargeable battery, which is really handy. And then you've got the sort of the brains of the operation, which is the WeMOS chip. Now, this is a tiny device. This is 1.5 inches square. I mean, it is tiny, and it's a Wi-Fi access point, a web server, a CPU with configurable, downloadable code, and a whole bunch of pins, I/O ports that you can attach sensors to, or drive output signals to things. So on this particular configuration, you've got 2 sensors connected as inputs. You've got the gyroscope, which is the same sort of device that you have on your mobile phone that detects the angle that it's situated, and a thermometer. Okay, so on the next slide, I've superimposed the actual components over these blue blocks. So left to right, you've got the battery and charger. You've got the CPU in the middle, and then you've got the accelerometer board below the on-off switch, and then the thermometer sensor, which is just a tiny little thing. And I've kind of deconstructed the wiring diagram from the PCB, and that is it. It's really, really simple. If you look at it, you've got 2 power rails, top and bottom, feeding each device, and then some I/O pins into the WeMOS. That's it. Okay. And then there's a question about buy or build. So as of today on eBay, you can buy them for £34 with free delivery, or £32. There's also contacts on Facebook groups. So there's an iSpindel Facebook group, and there's a couple of users who've been there from day one who build and sell and ship them as well. So you could, if you felt that was a more trusted route, you could go that route. I bought them, the first one from eBay, no problem. And then I did as per the bottom listing there, and I bought all the bits and then built it. You can source them. You can go to AliExpress and you can find most of the components. You might have to get a couple of them from specialist places. I guess the 2 that require you going to a specialist place are the PCB itself and sort of test tube. Actually, the test tube is an unblown Pepsi bottle. So when they're made, they come in that little test tube size with the top, and then they're heated and extruded to make Pepsi bottles. So That's the origin of those, but you can only get them from one place in Lithuania. So sometimes it's much easier to just pay someone who's already sort of gathered it together for you. But depends what you want to do with it. If you want to build it for all your mates and family and friends as well, then maybe you want to bulk buy some of this stuff. The parts are all laid out there. Actually, that PCB is a specific PCB put together by somebody who's got a really good YouTube channel, but the most common board is a Cherry Phillips board. I mentioned that in passing. Okay, if you want to build it, there's a really good YouTube channel called Woolly Craft Beer, and there's only 3 videos on there, and they're the ones on the right, but they're just perfect. They show you building it step by step. It's really well filmed and really well laid out, so it's super easy to follow. But it also shows you how you can then calibrate it, because you need to establish some baseline sort of positions as with any measuring device, and then there's a video for connecting it to BrewPilot, which is one of your connecting options. The PCB that I mentioned on the previous slide is built by the guy who does open source distilling channel, and that's the second bullet there. So they're well worth checking out if you want to sort of get a size and size up the effort and complexity before you buy, if you want to. I have created a web page. I haven't shared the URL here, but I will share it subsequently, which has a whole bunch of links to other resources, web pages, and so on. Okay. So what does it actually do? Well, when you power it on, the first thing it does is establish itself as a wireless access point and a web server. So what you see on the right is the list of available networks in my home. I've blurred out my ones, but the one at the top is the iSpindel. So it says, here I am. When you connect to it, you then get offered a home page, which I'll show you in a sec, which allows you then to input some key information so that it can do what it does. Well, what does it do? Well, essentially, it will put itself to sleep, and then every n seconds, and we'll see the place where you put that in a sec, it wakes up and sends its core values, which are tilt angle, temperature, and gravity. It sends that wherever you choose to send it, and you can configure where you send it as well. Okay. So when you do connect to it, and you can connect to it on a laptop or your mobile phone, it's perfectly happy to. You get the home page on the left. The page 1, you can see on the right hand side, it gives you the actual values that the device is experiencing right now. And page 4 is a general info, a bit like an about option that tells you, what version of the chip and the software you're running and so on. I only went into it to get a screen grab for this presentation. But pages 2 and 3 I'll cover in the following slides. So let's we move on to that. So the first thing you want to do is to just do some baseline calibration. The first of those is teach it what horizontal looks like. So you lay it on a flat surface, press the blue button on the screen there. It takes just under a minute, and then it will say, gotcha, right. I've now recorded the value for 0 degrees. And so now it can report every tilt from that as an actual degree. So 90 degrees would be vertical. No, that's the other way around. Actually, 90 would be flat from that point on, and 0 would be vertical. And so the next thing you do is put it in some water and see what angle it's showing you. Now that you've baseline configured it, it should be close to 25 degrees. And I'm not sure why. I've never seen any documentation that explains why 25 is key. You can be sort of plus or minus half a degree on that one, but I'm figuring it's something to do with the linearity of the measurements and the sort of physical geometry of the device. But if the angle is too high, you can make some adjustments. So mine was a little bit too vertical, so you need to weigh it down. So the two pictures on the left at the bottom show how the board was mounted inside the sort of test tube when I got it. And I just sort of shoved them in a bit more and actually just lowered the center of gravity just enough to up the angle. But sometimes that's enough. In my instance, it wasn't. So the third picture there, you can see I've blue tacked a washer to the bottom of the battery case. It's very common to just attach something. Some people use glue. I use blue tack just in case the tube cracked and I had to replace it, and then I'd have to do the geometry all over again. So I didn't want to make something permanent. But yeah, so that's the baseline on the angles. And then the next thing is, this looks busy and complex, but it's actually not. What you then need to do is measure some known gravities and plot a graph. You can see there's a URL there in the second paragraph, which you go to, and it opens up this spreadsheet. It's super easy. If you look at the spreadsheet, there's two red circles around gravity and angle. So you make up some gravities. I started with the 1080, just sugar and water, and then entered that value. And then I put in at 10-point intervals all the way down to water. And as you add each of those each time, it builds up automatically the graph on the right-hand side. And then it builds up a three-level polynomial to describe a line, if you like, that would cover those dots. So I had to measure every gravity with my hydrometer, so I'm relying on that being truth. But you tend to do that, don't you? You use a measuring device to configure or baseline another. But one of the videos earlier actually takes you through the config, so you can use I think it's Brewer's Friend tools to add the right amount of water to liquor down a 1080 to a 1070. So it's really helpful, kind of guides you through it. And once you've got that polynomial, I've copied and pasted it on the left-hand side. That is the equation that turns the angle into a gravity. So now you're at the point now where you're ready to tell the device what it should do. So if we just move on, this is the config page. Now, it's actually more than one screen's worth. You can scroll down, but if you look on the left hand of the two screens, it says number of minutes 900. And if you look at the top of the right hand one, it's number of minutes 900. So I've actually you've got two halves of the screen there, if that makes sense. And from the top on the left hand one, or I guess looking at it, you've got a set of Wi-Fi. Again, I've graded them out because they're all my neighbours. You put in the SSID and the password, you put your Wi-Fi in. Then you give your iSpindel a name. I've called it 001. Guess what I call the physical one? That's seconds. Now, 900 is when we move to the right-hand side because they're all kind of labelled. 900 seconds is every 15 minutes. You could do more. If you wanted to do hourly, then you'd preserve your battery life, and it would wake up. It would be perfectly fine for the level of granularity you need. Worth mentioning that if you do want to connect to BrewPilot, you do need to set that to 900. It's just a prerequisite of the way BrewPilot service has been built to receive iSpindel numbers. Below that, you've got a battery conversion factor. That's a preset number. I didn't put that in, so you don't have to worry about that. In Celsius, it's kind of given for this part of the world. And then the next 3 boxes are around the service type, and we will talk more about those in coming slides, but they're essentially saying, where do you want to write the numbers? And then if you just pass your eye down to the bottom, you've got that equation, that polynomial. So sort of working backwards, you've got an equation to convert the angle to gravity. You've got a service, which is where you want to send that gravity and the temperature and the angle. You've got, you want to, every 15 minutes to wake up, identify itself as iSpindel, and talk to that service via the Wi-Fi of your choice. So it's all fairly kind of logical, really. And then the second that you power the device off, it will wake itself up as per those instructions. So that's it, really. So if we just move on. There are a number of things you can connect it to. I'll kind of, on the right-hand side, you've got a whole bunch of web services that you can talk to. So, you know, about BrewPilot, Ubidots and Blink are dashboards. They're kind of graphs and MI analytics dashboards, and you can pay a subscription to use them, but if you're happy only to connect up to 1 or 2 devices on Ubidots, it's free. So that suits me. BrewPilot is again a Raspberry Pi and temperature controller device, so you can talk to that directly, and we'll show that later. BrewSpy is an app that it only works on Android. Unfortunately, they have absolutely no intention of putting it on iOS devices, because to develop iOS applications, you must use a Mac, and they're kind of unhappy to comply with that policy. And then at the bottom, you've got monitor.beer. I took a look at it today. It's kind of cool. You get a graph that you can hover over, shows you values and so on. I haven't seen whether it's free or subscription. I couldn't find that part of it. I think you have to register and sign up for it to find out, and I was unwilling to do that. But if you don't talk directly to kind of web services, you can talk to other devices. So at the bottom, you've got the Nautilus iSpindel relay, and as you can tell from the sort of chunky aerial, that's also a Wi-Fi device. You can sit it anywhere in your house, but obviously you can put it on the fermenter, and as you walk past, you can see the value inside. It also stores all the values that are coming out of the spindle, and can also write to any of those services on the right-hand side. So you've kind of got an intermediate option, which is I want to write to a bit of physical hardware, which then writes to the web. And then at the top here, and I'll pause for some questions, I guess, after this, but that's just meant to represent a generic web server. There's nothing to stop you writing your own web service that, for example, created a Google Docs spreadsheet, for example, and as long as you tell the iSpindel in that service screen, I want to write an HTTP service to mywebserver.com/iSpindel, or whatever you want to call it, it can then write to a Google Sheets. You know, there are people out there who have done it. It wasn't a route I went, so I'm not experienced in that particular channel. I'm just going to pause. I realise I've passed on a lot of info. Any questions? Silence is golden. You're either asleep or...
Just says really interesting, and thanks for clarifying. I bought one a few weeks ago, impulse purchase, and I've been slightly too terrified to get it out of the pack because I don't really understand how it works.
Right.
But it's been really clear so far. Thank you. I just wanted to say that. And I might have some questions in a bit.
Thank you. Well, it proves you can hear me, which is good, and it's coming over, so I appreciate that, Steve. Thanks. Right, okay, should we...
David, there's you've also got the option of going with a BrewPilot, which
I've got that
can be
coming up.
You got that one later?
Yeah, I've got that coming up. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't cover it in detail, so I think either you or Jerome could probably fill me in if I miss anything out. But yeah, I do cover that in a bit.
Okay,
David,
cool.
can I ask a really perhaps stupid question? I brew out in the garage where I don't have Wi-Fi connectivity. I'm just thinking about is this intermediate thing an option if I was to use that and move it, or just some thoughts about that? No Wi-Fi where I brew. Is it a definite no?
Yeah, so well, I mean, you do have to get Wi-Fi there. I mean, and the other option is you could use a tilt, which is Bluetooth, but then you'd have to get some old iPhone out of the drawer and leave it plugged in close to it. So it's not perfect either way. I mean, to put a repeater, or if you've got a mesh network at home, to put another dish or at least an access point, in a socket near your brew shed or near enough so that the device can reach it, you should be fine. These devices also work through stainless steel closed conicals, double walled kind of devices, so they're pretty powerful for the size. I don't know if that helps, but you do need to access some kind of Wi-Fi.
If you've got power there, you could use the power line extender, which has got a Wi-Fi access point. That's what I use because my garage is a Faraday cage. It's steel. It stops any signals from the Wi-Fi getting in there at the best of times. So
Right.
I think that's what you meant by that type of mesh thing.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Right, thanks, buddy.
David, I've used tilts in their various versions for years, and with the tilt, the calibration procedure is almost single point, when you can add more points. Why, given the fact that all the components in there are, I'm guessing, if they're standard and therefore probably the same weight, why would you need? Why is the calibration procedure so much more sort of rigorous and comprehensive with an iSpindel?
I'm going to give you a best guess here.
Yeah.
I imagine that because the tilt is a product, it's all of the components are probably very firmly situated on it. There's probably quality control, and there's probably no variance in the geometry, the weight, the distribution of stuff. I would, and this is a guess, but some of the boards are kind of floating on pins, so there will be variances. As to the question about calibrating the gravities, you could just calibrate a 1080 and once you've got water at 25 degrees, which you already know, you could calibrate a 1080 and then it would draw a straight line in between the two. But that might not, because it's not 100% linear, it might not cover some of the minor variances that you would get off that line. So the polynomial is possibly overkill, but does give you more accuracy in between those two extremes. My only guess is that there's more quality control and more consistency in the build. Like a tilt will always be exactly the same, whereas where you source your PCB from might be different, and there's more than one PCB design. So that's all I can guess there.
I think as well, when the iSpindel was first developed, it wasn't even on a PCB. You were doing it on a bit of circuit board, and you were using a 3D printed sled to actually hold all the components together. So I think there were a lot more variables in the way it was made. I think the more recent boards, they fit perfectly, and they're more likely, the way that the people have designed how the components actually fit, removes a lot of the variables. So you could probably get away with a 2 point. I think people do.
I think the biggest variable is the weight of the battery.
Yeah.
It's pretty, because you can get lots of different batteries, and the position of the PCB actually in the tube, that's only got to be out a little bit and you'll be out of whack.
Yeah.
Now, in the grand scheme of things, that may not make too much difference, but on the other hand, it's just adding to inaccuracies on inaccuracies. So
you can buy them calibrated. There's a website called, I think it's Asset Solutions or something like that, and for an extra £5 they'll calibrate it for you.
Yeah.
There's also a cheats way. If you use a certain product, I can't remember which one it is now, they get people to put in what they've calibrated. So as long as you use the same PCB and components, you don't do any calibration other than in water, and you just pop the polynomial in and away you go.
Yeah.
You know, you pays your money, it takes your choice, basically.
Yeah.
I think by consensus, it's the variability of the build. The calibration stage is quite fun, though. It doesn't take long, and you're firmly telling it what angle relates to which gravity, which I think does improve the accuracy.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's interesting.
You happy to move on, Darren?
Oh, sorry, can I just ask a quick question? And it's probably a bit of a silly question, but if you build your own, I take it you need your soldering iron.
You do, yeah. You do need a soldering iron. Yeah.
Even if you had one, I would say it was probably still worth the extra couple of quid, unless you really have got a couple of hours on a Sunday afternoon. Just buy one ready-made, I guess.
Yeah, well, I did buy one to build the second one because it was good fun and it works exactly the same. So, yeah. But yeah,
It's how much you enjoy soldering, I think. I mean, if you're not interested in soldering, yeah, just buy one ready-made. But I quite enjoy soldering, so.
I think that's something about this hobby that I'm finding, which is for everybody who goes and buys a grain father, there's somebody who fishes 3 old barrels out of a canal and turns them into a 3-vessel system. There's 100 ways of skinning the cat, I guess.
Enjoying some soldering yesterday, making up some temperature probes.
For BrewPilot?
No, just for my my PIDs. So I had some new PT100 probes and they needed connectors on the end of them. Nice sort of little XLR connectors so I can unplug them when needed.
Cool.
That's another talk.
Are you happy to page on, Darren?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, yeah. So I connect to a service called Ubidots, which is a web-based Internet of Things dashboard. It's set up so that any device in any capacity with the right information could write to it, and you can produce graphs. You can see a little version of the graph in the corner. There's a bigger version of that later in the pack. But essentially, within the service box, and I've exploded it from the mobile screen to kind of show you, you put a service type of Ubidots in there. Somebody's already pre-coded that into the iSpindel firmware. The token is essentially your password, your individual password, so it knows what account to write to. The second you put those values in and turn it off, it powers itself straight back on, and you get the screen in the top right, which is the Ubidots list of devices. It says, oh, I know about iSpindel 001. That's just written to me. And then you can start building a data, and it's completely buildable. It's all sort of, WYSIWYG kind of moving widgets around to report what you want. And as I say, we'll look at that screen in a bit. So I use Ubidots. I've made it work on BrewFather, and we'll talk about that, I think, on the next slide. Actually, it's probably a good time. Page on. There we are. So again, I've exploded the service box. This time you don't put, they haven't pre-coded BrewFather in that it's an HTTP service. You're going to write a web URL, and then at the bottom, you paste in the URI from the top right screen. So when you in BrewFather say, I'd like to use an iSpindel, you have to have a subscription for that to use other devices. But if you say I want to use an iSpindel, you put in some base details about the device, but you also paste that fogged out URL into the service type box on the iSpindel so that it can talk straight away to BrewFather. And the bit I've obfuscated at the end is the generated token that says it's my account. And then it starts producing numbers right away. So you can then, once the iSpindel has spoken to BrewFather, you can attach that device to a batch while it's in the fermentation stage, and it will start producing the graph that you can see there. Brewer's Friend also supports the iSpindel. And as I say, I looked at the monitor.beer dashboard today and it looked really good. There's quite a few services out there. And then the next one is the BrewPi, which becomes the BrewPilot. I learnt about this from Jerome and Peter. Pull me up on the facts. The BrewPi was a temperature controller, so you can see the sort of hacked fridge on the left, sort of thermal relay outputs that can power the elf. It doesn't record the values and it can't talk to anything. So they basically just plugged in a Raspberry Pi.
Oh no.
Oh, I think we just lost him. No.
Come back.
Oh, there.
He's back. He's back.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me now. Wow, that's scary. Sorry. Where did I get to? So you've got a.
Could you start that slide again?
Temperature
Actually,
control.
Because I think we missed.
Yeah.
At the beginning, to be honest.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. So essentially, you've got a hacked fridge, which many of you will have. You have a temperature controller device next to it, which is the BrewPi Spark, which has 2 temperature inputs and 2 kind of relay outputs, so it can power your cooler or heater. The trouble is that it's just like an Inkbird. It's dumb as, but it has a display on it, which is a bit prettier. But it can't record the values it's seeing, and it can't talk to anything. So as part of the development, they basically plumbed in a Raspberry Pi, which can then record all the values for a fermentation and write them to a service. Now, the native mode when you buy a BrewPi is to write to the BrewPi website. But if we just click to the next slide, rather than have a temperature controller and then a Wi-Fi access point, why don't you just use the same chip that's in the spindle to do both? So that's where the BrewPilot came out, and it's Pilot because you don't have a Raspberry Pi. That's essentially it. Is that about right, Jerome?
Yes, that's exactly that. Yeah, it's a case of the Pi's over spec'd really for doing the job. And of course, it makes everything more power-wise. It's much easier and so on. But yeah, basically using exactly the same chip.
Yeah. So that if you just click the next bit, you've got a little animation of a spindle coming into the FV, and that essentially can talk to the BrewPilot. The BrewPilot can then send the spindle's data as well as its own data to BrewFather or Ubidots or whatever service you're using. So you've got the added benefit of a very low cost temperature controller and hydrometer and thermometer there. And I think from memory, the BrewPilot also has some firmware that is written software, sorry, that is written to help you calibrate the values coming out of the iSpindel. Is that right?
Yeah, you can calibrate it in real time. So basically, you do if you do a strong brew and you get your OG, and as you're taking samples, you put that data in real time, and those samples will then create your polynomial. So you just do a brew, say something nice and strong, so that you've got your high value, and then just take samples as the fermentation is progressing, and you just bung those straight in, and it's creating its own polynomial that way, which means you don't have to calibrate with sugar or anything.
Can you just
So
run
there's, I guess,
by
extra
me what a
complexity in the
polynomial is?
build. Yeah, it's an equation that derives a line. So if you imagine y equals number x is a straight line of slope number. If you then add an x squared, you can describe a curved line. And if you then describe an x cubed, sorry, you can then derive an S-shaped line. So if your points are scattered around, you might be able to find a gently sloping S shape that would cover most of those dots.
Okay, thanks. And what you're saying here is
Does that make sense? I
yeah,
mean,
pretty much. Yeah. But what you're saying here is that the iSpindel can control the fridge temperature.
Yes. Yeah. In theory, it can. Most people use, if the setup that you've got on the screen there, most people use the temperature controllers that are coming out of the fridge, because you'll get, the temperature sensors that are actually connected up anyway, because one being in your thermo well, and the other one being in a smaller mass of liquid in the fridge, you get a better control. People do say that the control you'd have to report back quite often from the iSpindel to get, so it's better to just use the sensors that are built into this anyway. You could use the temperature sensor in the tilt, but there's no point.
But you can in BrewFather, you can have both of those. So if you're getting your data into BrewFather, one lot coming from the iSpindel, one lot coming from BrewPilot, you can actually plot the different temperatures. And what I can see by having my fermentation controller taped to the side of the fermentation vessel versus the iSpindel temperature, it's about 1 degree centigrade difference typically.
Same here. Yeah, and it's because it's higher up in the vessel, I think, for a start. The iSpindel is floating further up in the liquid, whereas my thermo well's further down, and is probably going to be about a degree difference, I reckon. Yeah.
So from a practical brewing perspective, I sort of split the difference mentally to know what the temperature is probably.
So this replaces an inkbird, for example, where you manually popping it in the morning or in the evening or whatever you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, my version of the BrewPilot is a little white box with an input, power input, 2 power outputs for the fridge and the heater, and these temperature sensors go into that, and the iSpindel data goes into that. So I've done away with the whole lot.
So you don't write from the iSpindel to BrewFather.
No,
You actually
no,
collate it all in the BrewPilot and write it all.
It's all in
one
the
hit.
BrewPilot, and then there's you can look at all the data by using their web-based graph reader. So I don't even bother with BrewFather. I just sit and look at it on, you know, as the BrewPilot as its own web page.
I've gone for diversity just to prove that there's many different ways of doing things. I occasionally have problems with the Wi-Fi connection. BrewPilot is quite happy working by itself out in the garage, as long as it's got power. But sometimes the Wi-Fi connection used to get disrupted. By having the iSpindel also reporting back separately, if something fails, it's not the end of the world, because I know the controller is still controlling, but I'm just seeing one lot of data in what I use is BrewFather. But BrewPilot, as Jerome's saying, is it's got its own graph capability. So yeah, there's many different options once you start playing around with these things.
I mean, with BrewPilot, you can even set up spunding. You can set up a pressure sensor, and people are doing automatic spunding with it.
That's probably a discussion for another day.
I know.
I've had some
Yeah.
I've had some interesting difficulties with that, and I haven't quite cracked it.
Sounds fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to look a lot of this up. I'll let you carry on there.
Yeah, I mean, this is an iSpindel presentation, really, and I think what I wanted to do was highlight that there are multiple connectivity options, and using a BrewPilot with it is, as you've heard, is not uncommon model. I don't have a hacked fridge or fermentation control, so it's kind of it's not my experience. Yeah, and then actually, if you just click one more time, Darren, I've put in the server type settings. So within the spindle, you would point at the BrewPilot device with the IP address, and the BrewPilot will then gather the data. Okay. So here's a graph from one of my brews, and sort of on the left hand side you've got a bunch of widgets that, well, the temperature is quite important. I guess the voltage is less meaningful, but if you look at the battery strength graph below that, it kind of shows you that it declines steadily, but that's over 2 weeks. It's only when it starts getting, as you can see, the bottom of the graph is about 3. I hear that when the values drop below 3, the battery is probably running out of juice or life. So I literally lose a few points every 2-week fermentation, and then I recharge it for the next brew. You can derive ABV, because obviously that's a calculation based on the values you have. So I show ABV. There's no need for it, really. Days fermenting is quite helpful, just because I forget when I put it in at times, and obviously the current gravity. But if you just click one more time, Darren, I kind of want to highlight some stuff on the graph. So, I mean, at the top, at the start of fermentation, you can see that there's a little bit of lag before it kind of hits the cliff drop, as I've called it there, but, you know, before it starts racing away. And obviously that's data. So depending on whether you've got a starter or vitality, or you've rehydrated, or you've just used dry yeast, you can see batch to batch what's going on in the early stage. You can see that line there. I literally stand my fermenting vessel next to the radiator, and I've got a little pad heater underneath it, and an ink, but I've got an Inkbird, and I can keep it within 1.5 degrees, which is, you know, kind of suits me.
Oh, we lost him again. Bugger. I don't think he's coming back. Give him a minute. Oh, he's back. He's back. Are you there, David?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, we can hear you now.
I can see and hear. Oh, great. Sorry. I mean, this is 3G. I'm surprised we went as long as we did, Ben. Did you hear that?
Yep.
And pointing out that the gravity line is quite jagged. It's a really, really sensitive device. And you know, at the top of the liquid, you've got lots of yeast activity, croissant and all sorts, and it does stick to the device, which affects its buoyancy and the angle. So you do see sort of jagged line each brew. This one reached terminal gravity in 3.5 days, and you can kind of see exactly where it did. And also, we'll talk about this in a bit, but the value of the terminal gravity on the graph is lower than it was meant to be. Actually, the final gravity was 1010, so the device was wrong. But again, the geometry is affected by the clag caught around the top of the tube. Right, let's get on to the
David, sorry, just
what stuff.
David, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm sorry, it's Ian here. I just had a really quick question whilst you're on the graph. I kind of figured I'll ask the question as we go along. Again, compared to a tilt, so that all looks really similar, but when I hit FG or thereabouts, and I don't know, probably other people can chime in if they've got them too, but the line there tends to be much more stable. You know, it will vacillate between, let's say, 1010 and 10.9 for a couple of days if I'm really eking out the last couple of points, and then it will settle at 10.9, and then it will do the same thing between 10.9 and 10.8. Whereas if, you know, I can't quite see how many days you're covering there, but that even the FG looks jagged.
Is that in BrewPilot?
Yeah. No, that's on Ubidots.
I mean, what Ian's been looking at.
That's compared to a tilt.
Yeah, but are you looking at the graph in BrewPilot?
No, that's just off their Google Drive, you know, and spreadsheet.
Sorry, yeah, just because I know BrewPilot does some smoothing on the graph, so it takes out a lot of the lumps unless you click the raw data value on the graph.
No, this is raw data. Well, this is just, you know, raw data in Google Sheets.
I find it correlates a bit to the temperature. So you'll find when the temperature goes up, you'll get I can't remember which way around it goes, then you get a slight, either a slight increase or a slight decrease in the gravity.
Yes, you're right. You're right, actually. I was just looking at that graph there and seeing that the temperature does fluctuate. And I think that's what it is, because the two things are correlated. So when you cold crash, you get the when you do anything like cold or soft crashing, you get the slight change in the readings due to that.
Yeah, I don't believe that there's any temperature correction in the iSpindel algorithms.
No.
What I see when I cold crash, say an ale down to, from 18, 20 down to say 4, I will see a step change in the graph over time, but that's a false reading basically, because when you take a hydrometer sample at calibration temperature 20 degrees, it is what it should have been before it drops. So as a diagnostic tool, it's that the graphing is very useful.
But either side of that cold crash, are you getting, how much stability are you getting? You getting between that point, or because it looks, I can't.
Well, I don't even use the specific gravity as much as looking at the angle, because you can see the angle, and you in BrewPilot at least you see each of the readings is tabulated, and I just look to see changes in the angle. So at the start of fermentation, I know it's kicked off fermentation when the angle changes, while the SG is, the granularity is too big to pick up that it started.
Yeah. I think, for the first week or so, I think these devices are a bit all over the shop because of all the movement going on in the liquid. But I'm just interested in that steaming, the jaggedness, even when things have hit roughly FG. Again, I can't see how many points it's varying by, but I was just interested in it settling out. I think probably I'd be interested again performance-wise, but I've ended up just using the tilt, to be honest, to look at I'm looking for general patterns, not I don't trust any of the actual readings. I'm just looking for trends. But I did think that jaggedness at the end there was kind of interesting, and with you saying how sensitive it was, I wondered if that was something to do with it, or
I think it is directly.
As Jerome says, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it's directly the temperature. If you compare, like, where it's what's that, 18th of 3rd at 0003, you got a peak.
Yeah.
But directly above it, you got the temperature at its lowest point. If you follow it backwards, you can see that it matches the temperature profile.
Yeah, it does. So my temperature profile is based on when my heating comes on, and they directly coincide. In fact, you've got the same kind of mini 3-peat pattern repeating. I must admit, I download all the data from Ubidots and I paste it into Excel, and then when I do a graph, I tend to do a trend graph which smooths it all out. So you don't have to use Ubidots. You might get a more smooth curve if you were using something else. Shall we? Is it?
Yeah, move on. Go for it. Yeah.
Because I think some of the things to talk about come up here as well. Does it make better beer? Well, it's helpful to see what's going on in the fermentation. I've only been brewing a year, and definitely the first few batches I had noob nerves, didn't know what to expect. The airlocks stopped bubbling. What does that mean? Is it all over? Seeing that it's progressing and actually you're in the start of a really steep curve within 12 hours is really, really comforting. It's a bit of a hug of a device in that regard. And of course, you've got the devices inside fermenting vessels, so you're getting the reporter on the ground view of what's happening inside the vessel. I think additionally, it's really helpful not to have to take samples. The picture there is a standard Facebook post. I've obscured the guy's name because I don't want to be nasty, but it's the standard is the infected post on Facebook, to which you get a flurry of don't take the lid off replies, sampling the work to see where it's at in the fermenter, increasing the risk of oxidation. I'm a small batch brewer because I live in London and I've got no storage space, so I can't have large vessels. I can only make small batches with the pots and pans I own, and I resent giving away 100 ml every time I want to measure the gravity. It is worth adding, and you guys talked about curve being an important thing. You should always confirm the final gravity with an actual hydrometer at the end. And of course, if you're pressure fermenting, you don't really want to be opening the vessel. I guess if you're pressure fermenting, you can dispense to test it, can't you? But hey. The box at the bottom is that having the graphs is a visual record of what actually happened. So you can do the analysis. You can look at the curve and see what happened. I can see how the yeasts perform for me in the same environment. I can see the attenuation curves, which batches have gone quicker, which yeasts kind of respond well at whatever gravity. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also see the effect of your process on lag time as well. Just go on to the next one. You'll be pleased to hear there's only 2 more slides. Then there's the sort of timed events. So if you want to dry hop at a specific time at high Kreuzen, or as the fermentation is finishing, you can see it on the curve. You can see when it's flattening out. You can see when it's hit stable gravity. If you want to wait till 4 to 6 points from the end of fermentation and close the vessel so you can carbonate, this is in a CO2 shortage, you can, because the slope of the curve is visible, kind of measurable. You can see when it's close to finish. And also you can see when to package. So you don't have to wait longer than you need to if you're on a schedule, or if you want to make sure you build in sufficient time for diacetyl rest, you can do that because you can see the curve. The bottom box is about the kind of preciseness of it, which I think we've covered. The sort of jaggedness, sensitivity of it, the fact that Kreuzen and yeast matter kind of sticks to it a bit, which obviously is going to affect the absolute value. But again, we reiterate the point, it's the curve that kind of tells you what's going on inside. And then for the last slide, stuck fermentation. Well, it won't fix stuck fermentation, but you can see it's happened. And if you do any remediated action, you can directly see what's happening. So if you do, kind of stir it, increase the temperature, add some more yeast, you can see how far it's going to get. Stuck fermentation is one of those times where you want to intervene, but you don't want to be over fussy because it might have reached its terminal gravity. But you want to see that what you're doing is having an impact. Otherwise, you're kind of fishing a bit. So it is helpful for that, to see what's going on. And then, of course, the other thing is hop creep, which you can see a graph there that shows a little bit of an increase. I've certainly seen slightly more dramatic lifts than that on a beer. I also included a bit of text because I found this from some Canadian microbrewery website, and it kind of was saying that adding dry hops does kind of introduce some enzyme activity to liberate some fermentable sugar, and also has a little bit of sugar of its own, hops. But that different varietals introduce different levels of enzyme, which I didn't appreciate. And there's a list. I pasted it in not because it was relevant, but interesting. So I guess another thing you can do is see what happens to the residual gravity when you dry hop. So that's it, really. Open to all sorts of questions. If you have any.
That was great, David. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, I was just going to ask you because I've got all kinds of Arduino stuff that I play with here. But I guess if you go with the Pilot thing, you don't have to worry about that either, do you? So I've got temperature controllers and stuff all linked in. So, but not on the fermentation side, so on the ready for a herb system to kick in.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I want to know what it's going to take for Steve to actually put his newly acquired iSpindel into a brew.
Sky?
There. When are you going to put it in?
I've got a porter happening probably next week.
Do it.
And I've got I was going to ask about the pressure fermentation. Does it make a difference? And I slightly missed that bit on that slide. Does it make a difference, pressure fermentation? So if I'm say under 6 psi or 12 or 15 psi, does that have any effect on the angle or the claggability?
The only thing it might have an effect on is making sure that it's sealed properly.
Okay.
I mean, just a word of advice. Yeah, it's worth making sure that cap is decently on when you put it on.
Doing it
because obviously under pressure you're going to get more likelihood. I've had one iSpindel develop a leak when I hadn't done the lid up properly. Luckily, it was just a tiny bit of wart in the bottom, and I got away with it. But do be careful on that one. And obviously sanitizing it properly before you put it in.
Yes, that's true. That's a very good point.
Have you still got the with the cap? Have you taken off? Whoops! Have you taken off the Duvalackers?
Yeah.
Unscrew the top.
Is that an Australian slang? I've done nothing with it.
Take the top off. Go on, be brave.
Yeah. I've done nothing with it.
What I was going to suggest is you get a lot of yeast crud around the bottom of the ring. You know the ring.
I'm always getting that, Pete.
Your cap.
Okay.
Your cap's got a ring on it, like you got on a milk bottle.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Could I suggest taking that off before you do any calibration? Because what I've found in there is it attracts all the gunge in there, and is hard to clean.
I can see where you mean. How do I get that off?
You just take it off.
I think yours is off actually.
Oh,
yeah. It is off.
The security.
Yeah, it's the security. Yeah. It's the tamper-proof.
Yeah,
it's the tamper-proof.
That's it. Tamper-proof.
So like the thing you get on pet.
Would you recommend pairing off because you know when you remove the tamper evidence, so you get the little bits of sprue where it's been attached. Would you recommend maybe pairing those off with a Stanley knife to?
Yeah, that's what I've done with mine. Yeah, take it off with a Stanley knife.
You could do, but I mean, to be honest, I probably used one, I don't know, 120 brews or something, and I've never had a problem with it grabbing any yeast and causing any infection or anything. And I just make sure mine's sort of like thoroughly cleaned and then just star sand before I put it in. and I haven't had a problem.
Okay.
I mean, people go on about worried about them being scratched and all this sort of stuff. I think it's not been a problem to me.
Okay.
But it doesn't. What I mean is, it doesn't affect the calibration. The pressure doesn't push it further down or skew the angle or anything like that.
I don't think so. No.
Okay.
I've used it quite a few times in pressure with the same yeast that I've used unpressurized.
Yeah.
And it's not discernible to me that it's affecting the readings.
Sweet.
And I've gone up to 15 PSI.
Okay, cool.
But if you look at my screenshot behind me over that way,
Okay.
you can see what it's like in the bottom of the fermenter.
Oh yeah.
When it's attracted all the yeast.
Yeah.
I give mine a brief rinse in PBW. I spray it off with water, give it a rinse with PBW, spray it off again, and then I use a toothbrush to get, because my top's got a lot of serrated edges, and I think that just keeps bits of yeast and stuff in. So I give it a scrub with a toothbrush, maybe a bit anal, but I don't really want one yeast to carry over to the next brew.
No, sure.
And then I give it a good star sanding before it goes in.
Sweet. I did get it off.
Ah, cool. Yeah. I must admit, what I do after every brew is I take the lid off, I lift the board out, and then I just take the shell of the test tube and the lid and soak them in OxyClean and make sure they're clean. I don't scrub them, obviously.
Like,
but
take the whole thing out.
Yeah, just take it out, I leave it on the side, and then I just make sure the vessel is as clean as it can be, and then pop it back in. Yeah.
Do you? I mean,
absolutely. I feared. Once it's in, it's in. It's calibrated.
I've got mine glued in.
For goodness sake.
I've got mine glued in. I've actually glued mine in with a bit of epoxy to stop it moving. And I've got one that's given me such reliable results, having checked it with a hydrometer either end. There's one of my iSpindels. It's just spot on, absolutely spot on.
I can highly recommend your blue tack approach, because that's how I've wedged my my second one I ever made, which uses a 3D printed sled. I've got a newer PCB based one now. They're a bit easier, but once it's in there, I would not take it out personally.
From
because I wedge mine in,
right? Apart from charge, you need to take it out to charge it.
No, you don't. You don't need to take it out to charge it. No. If you've got it stuck in there with a bit of blue tack, then you just put the charger in. I mean, as I say, I actually with mine, I put a couple of dabs of epoxy resin either side, which is still breakable if I needed to, but just to stop it, because I wondered whether the setup relied on it being in the same orientation in the tube. You know, I know it sounds, again, what are you looking at, but it's a molded bit of plastic. It's not that uniform. So once I'd set mine up, I just kept it as it was. I've never touched them.
It won't, it's not spinning in, it won't rotate in the tube.
Yeah, you want to push it right down to the bottom.
It does,
yeah.
it does.
Yeah, right.
So that's what I do, and that's why I'm not worried about taking it out, because I push it in so far it can't move. It's actually quite hard to get out. But this is why I'm not worried about it, because I calibrated it with it pushed fully in. But I do take the point, if I introduce more variables, then I'm not helping myself. It's been pretty accurate.
All right.
Give it a quick boil, Steve. 20 minutes should do it.
Oh, what?
A quick boil will be fine.
The whole thing?
Yeah. No, don't. That was.
No, I'm joking. But not get the inside wet, right?
No. That's why you need to use a pressure cooker.
Stop it.
Pressure cooker, there's an idea. In terms of faults, I have had one problem, which was that with the PCB based iSpindel, the battery can sometimes short out the pins coming up through the bottom. So in the battery holder, underneath, there's 2 soldered joints, and I got some strange readings, and I went on one of the forums, and somebody said, know what that is? You need to put a little bit of insulating tape just to make sure that those two pins are not getting shorted out by the cover of the battery. So if you have any questions, I think that there's at least a couple of iSpindel Facebook forums, and the people there are usually pretty helpful.
Sweet, thank you.
Can you? Is it possible to use them for making wine as well? Do they? That's not too silly a question.
I would guess so. I not know much about wine. I would imagine the OGs are considerably larger than beer.
Yeah.
Then perhaps your calibration has to be done at a different point of the curve.
Yeah, no, nice. Also, can you? Is it possible to remove them from the fermenter if you need to do something like if you've got a stock of dry hops or something else in there that you need to give a stir and then put it back, or is it a case of once it's in there, it needs to stay in there until it's finished?
I think they're robust enough that you can stir the hell out of it if you wanted to.
Okay.
It's just going to affect the readings whilst you're stirring and whilst it settles down again.
Yeah. Okay, super. Thank you.
Yeah, you kind of don't need to. Occasionally, I've had to fish mine out with a pair of sterilised, almost like barbecue tongs, stainless steel barbecue tongs that I've sterilised because, yeah, for one reason or other, I've realised that they've gone into a brew and it's not been calibrated properly. But otherwise, I'd leave it in. You just increasing the likelihood of introducing something you don't want in the beer. I would say I'd leave them in.
Yeah. It's just like if I had something that I needed to put in there to like stir in or whatever, whether I would need to take it out in order to not disturb it too much.
No, I'd give it a stir, unless you're going to get one of those drill paddles in there and
No, if you stir it, it'll give some odd readings anytime during that stirring that things have been messed up, but then it'll go back to how it was. So it's not going to spoil any disturbance of it. Isn't going to spoil your previous readings. It'll just come out as a little bit of an anomaly. I mean, you notice it when you dry hop, as you chuck the hops in, you will get it being disturbed slightly. And it's the iSpindel is sensitive enough to actually be able to pick up things like that. Or even when you take a dumping trub, and there's enough disturbance sometimes just dumping trub to actually look at the graph and say, that correlates to when I took a sample or dumped some yeast or whatever.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. I take mine out before cold crashing because when I put the fermenter inside my fridge, it can't write to the Wi-Fi quite so well. It's patchy. Plus, as was mentioned earlier, the value is just a bit weird when the temperature drops like that. So I got spooked and just fished it out. And so I tend to take mine out before I cold crash. I understand you don't need to, but I've also read that it can shorten the life of the battery as well, putting it in the fridge. I don't know if you guys have experienced that at all.
Well, I've had one running for 2 years now, I think, well, year and a half or whatever, and on 100 plus brews, and the battery's still perfectly all right. And that's reading every 15 minutes, which is well over the top. You don't need that amount of data.
I find with mine one of the most useful things you can do with it is one of the modified Narcissus sort of speeded up lager fermentations, because that relies on you changing the adjusting the temperature, even by a small amount, you know, when it's 50%, 75%, 90%. I mean, it doesn't need to be exactly that, but, you know, roughly through fermentation. You can do all of that without taking any samples, which I think is brilliant, absolutely brilliant for. And again, it's only relative, so that works well. And also, I think, like you've already said, David, you can intervene much more quickly. You know, these days I'll just leave a beer in for 2 weeks and forget about it, but I can see after day 5 if I'm going to have a problem with any attenuation or anything, and you can sort of intervene without worrying about taking samples, which is really useful. But yeah, I think they're great tools.
Yeah, I mean, just noticing the difference between different yeast varieties, strains, and so on it's really fascinating to be able to think, oh right, I can see what's going on there. A little bit of a lag, or, you know, say if you any chance of under pitching, and you're going to see it straight away. So they as you can get them to be really accurate, but then I think that's like a lot of equipment anyway. I mean, does everyone make sure that their sample is measured at a particular temperature? Say, you know, is everyone temperature correcting their hydrometer readings anyway, or does, you know, so. It's all relative, but you can get them to be very accurate. But just the trends of something, it is very useful. I find it very useful.
I think that sounds like one of the biggest advantages, I think, because sometimes, like I'll forget to take I'm not saying I take a daily sample, but it's 100 mils or 200 mils every day for like 2 weeks, and you're looking at like whatever that is, a litre, 2 litres, something like that. There's potential you can introduce some stuff into it while you're doing it. But yeah, of course, you don't want to be wasting that, because what do you do? Drink it or pour it down the sink or whatever. But especially when you're approaching terminal gravity, to know when you're at terminal gravity, to not have to take 3, 4, 5 samples, sounds like a really big advantage. And also to see the curve. And I see what you're saying, Jerome. You can identify differences between yeast. That's amazing. That would be really interesting.
Well,
just
you're relying
all sorts of
those are data points I can't take manually.
Yeah, I mean, it's just useful for all sorts of things. Like, for instance, as you say, terminal gravity, what effect it's going to have on it if you do whatever, because you can see, say, for instance, temperature variation and so on. I mean, and it's just useful to have if you're into that sort of thing. I mean, if you're not, then fair enough. But if you're into, say, getting the data and being able to compare one graph with another and think, oh, what was the difference I did there? Oh, right. Yeah. And there have been things that have been shown up by, you know, say, bad process, which I've identified by that, where I thought, well, what went wrong? Why was that beer like that? Oh, it sat on the hops too long, or whatever, or I hadn't left it long enough because it was still fermenting before, whatever. Yeah, so it can be a useful tool. Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
And then, of course, there's just the basic. I can see how fast my Quebec is fermenting. I did one. I've done 2 Quebec brews because it's getting warmer here. Sorry to you lot, but it is getting nice and warm here. And that graph that David put up was a very, very shallow angle. It needs to be a bit more vertical. It's just the geekery of being able to watch your fermentation, especially when you've got a tool like BrewPilot. You can see it anywhere, anytime. And the thing I like about BrewPilot is that all my brew day record is in the one place. So I've got the fermentation profiles. It would be lovely if the software developer would let you overlay graphs so that you could actually monitor performance. But then I think about it and I think, have I ever done a beer intentionally with the same ingredients and the same way in 350 beers? No. So probably not a huge importance.
what are we if we're not geeks, Pete?
Do you find that when you dry hop, it then effectively almost sort of recalibrates the iSpindel, and then you really are looking at relative readings, and then your FG ends up being different to the hydrometer reading at the end?
Yes, I do. I just have a quick look at my. I did a Bengal Lancer clone, or my version of one anyway, and I gave that a pretty decent dry hop with target, and I could see, where are we? Yeah, it seemed to form a raft because there was so much, it was pellet hops. It seemed to form a raft because the graph shifted up by a couple of SG points. And then it gradually went down over time again. So
yeah,
so the dry hop forming a raft must be just like the Croisen forming a raft in concept, I suppose.
Did you then compare your FG taken on the iSpindel to a hydrometer FG at the end?
Yeah.
And were they identical or still a difference?
There was still difference because I cold crashed down to 4 degrees, and where the iSpindel was, let's have a look. The iSpindel thought it was 1016, and when I measured it, it was 1014.
Yeah, yeah. I find with every single one of, I don't know, probably 70 odd brews, there's always that difference if you dry hop. And so as soon as you dry hop, you're into relative differences. Like you say, it steps up immediately, and then you can still watch things, change. But whatever it says is the actual gravity at that point is always a few points out compared to a hydrometer, which isn't a big deal. It means you take one sample to see where it is, because you're still seeing whether the gravity is changing, and that still holds true. But it's just, if anyone hasn't used one before and is thinking of getting one, or does try one out like you, Steve, it's just worth noting that dry hopping can sort of recalibrate it for you. And then when you take it out at the end, mine's a tilt, but it's the same thing, it's the same mechanism. Mine always has a thick, usually quite often has a thick plug of yeast and maybe a bit of hops and stuff stuck to the top of it. So it's clearly, that's what's recalibrating it, as it were.
If you were using BrewPilot, though, because it calibrates on the fly, it would take all of that into account. So we would take into account the fact that at this moment it's got some crud on it, or at this moment it's got colder, say you're soft crashing or whatever. So I'm just saying that if anyone happens to go further and use BrewPilot, then because you can calibrate on as you're doing a brew, it will take those things into account. So rather than trying to compare sugar and water in various gravities, it will be doing something in under real circumstances, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, you can do the same, similar with a tilt with a BrewPi, tilt pi. It's got a calibration screen that, when you take a gravity reading with yourself, you can then tell it this is what the actual gravity is now, and it'll recalibrate its reported measurements based on that.
Yeah, I mean, I could, even without that, I can still enter a new calibration point on the fly, on even without any of the remote things, and still tell it, actually, you think it's 1016, it's 1014. But to be honest, at that point, all I'm interested in is, if I take a sample and it's 1014, is it still dropping at all? If it's not over a few days, well, we're done, aren't we? And just because the tilt's still saying 1016, that doesn't, you run with that in the end, don't you?
Yeah.
You can do that in BrewFilot as well, can't you? You
can have
an offset
think so, yeah.
Yeah, the offset's really useful. I use that quite a few times. Once I've taken the hydrometer sample, so I know what my OG is, I'll then put an offset into BrewPilot so that everything lines up.
I don't know if you can see the graph I'm sharing. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Here's one of my first brews. I did dry hop and it was vertical, so it literally just shifted the SG down by, it's quite a lot, isn't it? It's about 8 points. But then it kind of leveled out on the final gravity, which meant it must have been held artificially high with Kreuzen, and then just chucking the hops in just knocked it all off or something. But again, it's all about the curve. I mean, where it shallows out, where it crosses the orange line, is when it's slowing down. So I did dry hop at the right time. It just, made the value a bit more real. So it really is all about the curve. Unless you do see an incline, which you could put down to hop creep, but I don't think you could.
I've noticed the difference between with hop creep, actually, to be honest, because it's only recently that I've started soft crashing and then dry hopping, and I don't get anywhere near as pronounced spike as I used to. I used to get a far more like that graph there. I'm just looking at one now, and it's a little bit of a nudge down, but it's far less noticeable now that I'm not getting that fermentation through hops. I mean, I'm talking about a lot of hops, say, sort of, these are Neepers and so on. So it's obviously putting a lot more active fermentation in there.
I've been playing about with iSpindel hub, and if Darren would let me share my screen, I'll put that up if you like.
Yeah, you should be fine, Peter. I managed to share mine.
Yeah, you should be able to share.
So it's like the Nautilus unit, except you don't have to pay for this other than buy a screen and a ESP8266. So it's developmental. There's this guy over in France that's doing it. It's an intermediate repeater. So if you wanted to see what's happening in the garage, your iSpindel simply sends it to the iSpind hub, and then we'll forward on to whatever application you choose. He's still working on getting the forwarding to work, but it gives you a local screen display. Now I've changed. I'm not a programmer by any stretch of the imagination, but I can fiddle. So I have fiddled about with his screen layout, and the one on the right here is my cleaned up version to make it a bit more legible. That's a 1.4 inch TFT screen. So if you're interested in having something as an intermediate out in your brew shed, and then repeat it on to somewhere else, this could well be an option once he's finished developing it.
Pete, is that Retina display?
A what? A Retina display? No, a TFT.
Anyway, I've got a pilt.
I'll move on from that attempt at humour.
It's clean though, Peter. I do like it. That is neat. That is neat.
So I'll put David, would you put that in the list of links?
Yeah, I will.
Okay,
I'll
cool.
put it on the site.
So Peter, just that is, so that basically, what's the difference in that and then, because you mentioned the power extension option to extend Wi-Fi. This is a sort of like a repeater version of that, or an alternative, or?
No, you still, this unit still needs Wi-Fi as it's between the iSpindel and the hub. That's a Wi-Fi connection. It works as an access point, and then it needs to forward on. So it needs another access point to forward it onto.
Yeah, so both these devices need to connect to the broadband router, the same one. So if they're both in the shed, it's not going to help.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
So what I use is a TP link, and you just plug it. Yeah, on the screen, you just plug it in the power screen display. I'll stick it in front of me. You just plug it in the power, and it's got a Wi-Fi access point, and I've got it set up just to replicate the Wi-Fi in the house, and that works. That has worked pretty well.
Yeah, those things are great. I use those with security cameras a lot, and they're brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
I was going to say I've done a bit of, I've got a tilt and I've written a bit of code. I mean, I'm a developer, so I've done a bit of code for displaying the readings of the tilt on a little screen that's on the Raspberry Pi. You have to plug in, like with a tilt, because it's Bluetooth. If you want to upload your recordings of the tilt to the cloud, you have to use a Raspberry Pi. So I've got a bit of code that can display it on the screen. So as opposed to having to use a phone. Anyway, if anybody's interested, then I can probably share it. So it's not a big deal. So it's quite handy, I think, to just be able to walk past and see the number on as you kind of walk past your ferment, as opposed to having to go into BrewPilot and read the graph. So I've done that. So I've done a bit of tinkering with the tilt. So I'm happy to share. It's not production strength, but I'm sure if you got a Raspberry Pi and a little screen, I mean, it's all cheap. Nowadays, you can get these screens for next to nothing. So, geeking, that's what we do.
I like the fact that by writing to Ubidots, wherever I can get any data connection, which is everywhere, I can check on the babies when I'm out, or down the shops or whatever. I quite like that.
I think that and a Wi-Fi Inkbird, and then you can set a diacetyl rest sitting by the pool in Cyprus to come back to be able to drop it again and dry hop.
Wow. Take it with you, warm the pool up.
That's brewing.
I mean, as with BrewPilot, you can of course set all sorts of schedules for it. So if you've got BrewPilot, you can then say after X number of days do this, or when it gets to this gravity, do that. So if you wanted to do any of those things with BrewPilot, you can set all of those parameters. So you could say, right, when it gets to a gravity of X, turn up the temperature by 1 degree over the next day, or you can then set all of the different parameters, whether it's gradual or whether it's set to particular timings or whatever. So those are the things I'd say that some people who messed around with spunding, if you've got a means of controlling a valve on a spunding valve, say, you could in theory set it up to do it automatically. But you can certainly set BrewPilot up to do a whole schedule of fermentation using any of the parameters that it comes in with, temperature or gravity.
Sounds like a presentation, Jerome.
Right, well, it might be the BrewPilot is the next one, or at least, give us a couple of months.
Automated brewing.
Yeah.
I mean, in the best way. Everyone likes to get their elbows dirty, but also you want to be hands off as well.
Yeah, well, an Inkbird to a certain extent is automated, isn't it? So
It's all about not getting your dirty fingernails in your beer.
I mean, I must say again, I don't really know anything. I don't know anything about coding and so on. I've just grabbed code off the internet and dubbed it using very well, sort of well-established guides to how to do it, where it just says, take this code, stick it on this device, and, you know, push this button, and there you go.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ESP32.
Bless it. Whatever that is.
So as
Wi-Fi funding.
This is great.
So as Jerome was saying, the BrewPilot, you got its own screen, so it's acting as a repeater, just like the other one is. Yeah. The other one would be more of a single. The iSpindel hub, more of a single use, just display. But I've got I've been using BrewPilot for 4 or 5 years, and yeah. And on the right is an actuator. I've been spunding for a while now with the red valve manually, and I've tried a couple of times with the pressure on a test bench, but I kept getting leaks. So I'm not quite there yet to automate the pressure, but I'm getting there slowly.
Good man. Someone's got to do it.
So Pete, you're able to automate the spunding valve itself.
Yeah, I'm just looking to see whether I got a picture of what I've got. The trouble being that I like playing around with electronics as an application, but there's more important things some days, and that is making sure you've got beer on tap. So,
absolutely. Get carried away.
So yeah.
You can't be too much of a geek in this game, though.
Are you not scared, Peter, that at some point Alexa or Siri might decide that you are underspunding and start making some of these decisions for you and like hack into your brew?
Or they'll invent crowdspunding and it'll be a community thing.
But that gag that David's made, very good work.
So we could connect it up to Slack and we could all sort of like trigger it by voting.
I swear to fucking God, we're going to be able to do this. It's like, that's the collaboration brew that no one's thought of yet.
Yeah, it's I've not been concerned about hacking, I must admit. I would have thought hackers probably had better things to do than worry about homebrewers.
Screw up your homebrew.
I mean, as it happens, I think because it only reports very briefly, say once every 15 minutes or whatever, you've only got a port open for if that's that aspect of it is the worrying thing. It's only open for a brief period of time, just enough time for the thing to report back.
Yeah, I suppose it's only a mere smidgen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I got a blow tie on the fermenter, and that's my production BrewPilot. As you see, it fully conforms to all rules and regulations for power wiring.
Sure, it does.
Yeah, so I've been using SSRs. I was going through too many of these relay units. The cheap Chinese things just kept burning out. But I have mounted my spunding arrangement externally now, and just run a piece of tubing outside of the outside of the fermentation chamber.
How does it work, Pete? How do you change the? Are you able to change the pressure there?
Well, manually at the moment.
That's what I thought you were getting at. I thought you were saying you could.
I think he was trying.
You can do it in
from the
BrewPilot.
beach in Cyprus, change the PSI from 12 to 14 or something.
You can do it. There is a device to do it. I have heard about it.
Oh, interested?
That sounds like an opportunity for extreme griefing, though. You know, it's yeah, nothing like sending your spawning file to 40 psi while you're away and just seeing what happens.
I want to make it work. Though. If that works, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Whilst the ink bird boils the beer for you whilst it's fermenting.
Yeah, it goes wrong.
That's where the hacking comes in, because you can hack somebody else's brewer to screw it up, can't you?
Yeah.
And then your keg,
I
and then
you've
your
got to
pressure.
be careful about the prime directive. The prime directive being, don't, inverted commas, stuff the beer up.
I love a prime directive. I think I watched that the other day. I can't remember what movie.
If Hal decides he needs to protect the beer from you.
Exactly.
So I was just scrabbling around looking for this. So here's the version I've tried. And I've
this shit. Look at this.
So that goes up outside the fridge. I just force it between the seal of the door and the door.
Yeah.
Comes in here. Then this is the pressure transducer here. Put the blow tie here, so that's manual control. Eventually, I'm looking to put the solenoid valve in there in place. With this
twist
iteration,
the valve
I
for
just
you.
want to be able to monitor the pressure, and the pressure is reported into BrewFather, so you can see what's going on. But I had a couple of good goes. As you can see, this is another iteration of that one's using an 8266 rather than the ESP32. And I haven't quite got the calibration sorted, but brewing took precedence, so I haven't done anything for a couple of months. Next version, hopefully, I'll make sure the monitoring works reliably, and then I'll have a go with the solenoid control. And I've got another SSR down here to do that control.
What would that do? The solenoid control. I'm new to electronics, really.
It's got lots of colored things.
Right. Does it twist that knob for you?
No, that's where the brewer exercises control.
Okay. Okay. This is amazing. Fucking hell.
So I guess sometime in the future, when you're short of a talk, we can perhaps talk about how I might have achieved pressure fermentation remotely, but not just at the minute.
Honestly, this whole like remote automation of brewing from a homebrew scale scenario point of view is
these little beasties.
Got a presentation written all over it.
They're about $5 Australian.
Yeah, £2.50.
Yeah. 2 or 3 quid UK.
Yeah.
This one's got an analog to digital converter to interface to this. But yeah, I've always fiddled with electronics, and I've always liked beer, so it sort of all goes together rather nicely.
Oh, that's amazing. If you can turn it into something for someone who doesn't really understand electronics, and like that could automate their beer, that would be amazing.
Oh, well, there's plenty of people that say you can brew beer in a week, aren't there?
Sure. Man.
Beer automates itself.
Well, True. Yeast automates the beer. Suppose.
But this sort of information becoming available because of cheap microprocessors.
Yeah. There's a lot you can do, right?
20 years ago, you'd be well, you wouldn't even be thinking of this. 20 years ago, you'd still be doing what quite a lot of people are doing, is having a dip in the tasting jar every few days if you're that keen to know how your fermentation's going. So
the amount of data you're able to get out of it is hugely valuable to the kind of growing geekery of the brewer. So all those data points, as it were, all that information that you're able to have on every curve, whether you're any good at electronics or not. But back to kind of David's iSpindel version of it, the information that you're getting back, that you're able to say, well, that's when I did that dry hop, or you're able to say that's the difference between this and the other yeast, is something that you just wouldn't have without the electronics, as it were, right?
Yeah.
Unless you took a sample every 20 minutes.
The lag time, how long it takes to kick off, I can see a difference. That just broad brush, I can see a difference between the amount of time it takes for dry yeast to kick off, not hydrated, just chucked on the top. I can see the difference of just pitching a White Labs tube on its own, no starter, versus doing a shaken not stirred. Shaken not stirred starter, 3, or repitching same day yeast, couple of good sanitized spoonfuls, 3 or 4 hours and the angle's changing.
Yeah, I've found that same thing. Say, looking at whether it's repitching yeast, it's shown me, for instance, that I can repitch a yeast, and if I give it enough, it'll be off within hours. Seeing that start, is very, very useful, because it just shows you whether you pitched properly. Yeah,
feedback.
That's it. So having the data is really interesting, but it's then what you do with it.
I mean, you can have it just to look at all the pretty graphs.
Yeah.
It's perfectly valid. Perfectly valid. Don't let anybody say that. So somebody that doesn't understand brewing, and you show them a graph with lots of colors, they're impressed. You don't have to, and as long as the beer tastes all right, you're fine.
I do a bit of web for work. I do web publishing with some Google Analytics, but love a graph, and that's what you do with the data is the point. It's not having a lovely graph that looks nice. It's what does that tell you? What do you do with it?
But I have looked back through previous graphs to find out what has gone wrong with or right with a brew, and seeing whether that is worth following through, when to pitch, when to dry hop, for instance, and so on. All of those things I can look back, and it's just, as you say, it depends what you do with it. But it has been useful in the past to look back on a brew and say, well, what happened? Oh, I can see what happened. And it might be, I left it on that for too long, because I've got day-to-day data, which is visual. And by having a graph, I mean, it's a graphical representation of data. So, useful.
Very. Thanks.
I mean, the classic thing is you don't need it. you really don't need it unless you find that sort of thing useful. It
can make you better.
It can make you better beer, but it's like all sorts of things, which bit of the process do you nail in on, nail down.
Just, I think to summarize there, I think obviously it depends, but there's certain types of beers and fermentations which are a bit timing sensitive.
Yeah.
As in, if you have to make decisions based on a current attenuation level, you know, these immersion hydrometers, they start to really pay dividends. You know, especially if you're looking online and seeing, all right, it's at 70% now, it's time to do the next thing, or do the temperature change, or now we're like 3 points above terminal estimated terminal, so this is the time we want to package if we're doing like an English style cask. You know, it's that's a point where it stops being a nice novelty with nice graphs and is it making my beer better or not, to the point where you're better informed to make decisions that can influence the quality of the beer.
Yeah.
Right? If you're doing very simple stuff, yeah, it's a nice novelty. You've already paid for it. It's sitting in your fermenter. But if you're actually trying to do fast lager fermentations, or maybe monitor troubled yeast pitches, you know, I think for what is a fairly cheap piece of kit, probably pays for itself in peace of mind really quickly.
Yeah.
If you think of it like that, like as a diagnostic tool rather than a fermentation graph maker, then it's incredibly valuable. Exactly. I mean, perfect examples, Rich.
Yeah, one of the use cases I was thinking of actually is a question for James. I think at one point you were talking about a really high ABV beer that, rather than shock the yeast with all of the sugar in one hit, didn't you add additional sugar during fermentation to help dry it out and make the strength? I might have misquoted you there, but I was thinking about, I've heard it done, I'm sure James mentioned it. Is there a time when you need to add that sugar in the fermentation?
I've heard of it done. I've not done it myself.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether it was me. I mean, I did the nearly 12% triple IPA earlier on this year, and that was, it wasn't quite 10% sugar, but that all went in the boil and everything. So yeah.
Okay.
I think you need to go quite high sugar levels to do that, and that's more. It's less to do with shocking the yeast and more to do with getting them to ferment the longer chain sugars first.
Okay.
Otherwise, without sort of knowing or being able to explain the sort of how they metabolize the sugars, they sort of get a bit lazy and clapped out once they've eaten all the short chain sugars and don't bother with the longer chain stuff. But equally, I managed to drive a very strong beer down quite low anyway, despite but it wasn't 25% sugar, it was sort of 7 or 8%.
Okay. I was thinking though, would there be, would you want to time that right? I think based on what you've just said, they get a bit clapped out after all that work near the end. So you probably want to pitch it before it finishes, but once it's chewed through some of the longer chain stuff, which means
I would do it whilst the yeast is going.
Right.
Because the danger is that you do it towards the end of the fermentation. You kick off fermentation in a way, it produces a bunch of diacetyl and acetaldehyde and other fermentation products that normally get used up at the end, and then it doesn't use them up at the end. So that's kind of the danger of doing it. But I mean, it's one of those things, it's going to be very heavily yeast dependent. Dependent upon the amount of sugar. If you're doing sort of bigger, I know like mead makers, because they're doing big strong meads with lots of simple sugar, will add nutrient throughout the process to stop sort of stressing the yeast. So that's another sort of way of looking at it. But there's a lot of different ways to deal with it.
So I guess the question is, would having visibility of that graph help with that stuff?
If it's something you want to do, then sure.
I would have thought it'd be very useful. Yeah, if you're doing that sort of fermentation where you're trying to control it. I mean, I imagine it's, say, if you're using enzymes and so on, it'd be interesting to see the effect because you would be able to see that effect on the graph of adding enzymes, say during fermentation, and what they're actually doing.
Any element of brewing, more data, recording more data points is better. Because then you can go back and refer to it and go, oh, that's what happened. Or you go back to it in a few beers' time and go, yeah, there's a pattern here. The more you record, and so I'm a big fan of like keep a brew log. It's a big way to advance your brewing, rather than just sort of bang it out on the day and don't note down anything. Keep a really detailed brew log, and if you can extend that to fermentation, then definitely do it. You know, then, like, is it slow fermentation? Is it a quick fermentation? What is it? I had one. I had one recently where I basically knew the beer was infected because it was still fermenting after 5 days. There was still airlock activity going on. I was like, that yeast never does that. Sure enough, when it was eventually done, tasted it, and it was like, well, smelt it, and it was like a box of plasters. So there's obviously some kind of wild yeast that got into it, but yeah.
Yeah, just another point there, David. There's I know of commercial breweries making big beers, and they're doing some co-fermentation. So they get all their character yeast, which takes them up to like 9-10%, and then it really starts to struggle, but they're targeting like 12%. And then the sugar comes in, other stuff comes in, and there's a decision point to be made. And if you're making like a triple IPA and you're aiming for the really high strength, and you want to bring in a sugar addition and your co-fermented yeast, then that timing starts to get interesting. And probably another case might be you're going for like really big lagers, like a Samichlaus clone, but you don't really want to hang around for 12 months. You get all your main fermentation done up to like 10%, and then a sugar addition comes in to dry it out, and maybe a second yeast, something a bit stronger like the S189 or something, or maybe even some like an ale yeast or champagne yeast. And these kind of decisions are sometimes a bit more commercial, where you don't really want a beer to be sitting around in your primary fermentation capacity for months. But those guys, well, they're probably not using iSpindels, but if you're trying to duplicate the same process and some of the same thought, some of the same thinking that goes into those guys' production methods, then timing of that second decision, yeah, that could be well informed by something like an iSpindel or one of the competitors.
Yeah, okay.
I've done a sugar feed at about 50% attenuation, but I didn't notice any difference between that and starting with the sugar from scratch. I think from what I understand, it's something that some of the commercial like double IPA brewers used to do in the States, and barley wine brewers used to do quite a few years ago. And now I'm not sure how. I think it's not that many people do it. I think they just start off these days with a massive pitch. So I think unless you're heading upwards of like 13%, then I don't, so unless you're doing, a sort of, I wouldn't say BrewDog novelty beer or whatever, but like maybe a Samichlaus or something really unusual, then I'm not sure you'd need to do it. And actually, I think to James's point, you can probably, on the enzyme front, you can probably achieve something just as well using enzymes. You won't see, unless you add them later on in the fermentation, you won't see anything on the graph, as it were. I've added them in the mash. I know Lee's added them in at the beginning of the boil. But obviously then the wort starts out what the wort's going to be. And so you don't notice it so much on the curve. The time when you do notice chucking enzymes in is when you get hop creep. That's the most noticeable I've found, and then you can really see it drop, even if you account for, like we talked about earlier, the rebasing of the level. I've seen a drop of sort of upwards, up to 6 points on hop creep on some brews. So that's when you would see it. But
and often when you do get that late sort of fermentation, if you add it in, I mean, I've heard about a brewer doing adding enzyme late on in the fermentation process. But when they did it, they also then used afterwards an additional enzyme to remove the diacetyl caused by it. So you can look it up. It's called Maturex, but not really available to homebrewers, unfortunately.
But you can buy it, but you had to buy it in like sort of 5 kilos at a time. It cost you about
not really
£500.
Not really worth it when I would add the enzyme or whatever you're going to do in the mash or in the boil or the bean in boil and be done with it then.
Yeah, just on that point, the addition of enzymes at terminal, or if something finishes high, that's when your enzymes can do crazy stuff. And I've seen like 20 points of gravity in a 55 liter batch taken down to like 0.000 levels. And if you're microdosing, and I'm talking like 0.1 mils of enzyme is what you need if you want to drop it by 5 points. And that's when, yeah, maybe a spindle might be better because the precision is just not there if you're taking samples. And the temptation is, I'm not seeing any activity here. I'll add a bit more. I'll add a bit more. I'll add a bit more. And that's where you end up with your pale ale turning into a brute IPA. So it's
my 11 plus 2 years ago turned into 1008 by that mistake, adding enzyme. It's like, it's at 1030. It's not dropping any further. I didn't know how much it wasn't dropping or anything. I was like, just squirt a bit more in, and it just went shoo. Fucked it. But yeah, easy done.
What about the? I mentioned it in the slides, but I'm certainly no expert on it. But the timing for dry hopping, that can be critical too, right? There's different schools around that. I mean,
one thing I quite like to do with the pressure fermentation, at least with a is to try and keep the hop aroma in, is pressure ferment maybe at like 4 psi. So if you're using an ale yeast that you want some esters off, you're not going to kill all the esters off. And then when you get to 4 points from terminal, is to whisk the lid off, in go your dry hops, either loose or in a bag or whatever it is. And then what I do would be to crank the spunding valve to say 15 psi, something like that, so that the rest of the fermentation would finish without off-gassing any of the precious aroma from your hops, kind of thing. So knowing what point that you could optimally do that and keep all the hop aroma in, is massively valuable. So if you can plot that and know by after a couple of brews experience when that works the best, so that fermentation finishes just before any of your hop aroma pops out of the spunding valve, then you cold crash it, you've hopefully kept as much as possible in.
Yeah.
Massively valuable, really good, really useful.
I mean, judging that with the iSpindel is tricky because you can't rely on the actual value being a clinical version of the actual gravity. But what you can see is that there's a relationship between the angle of the high Croisen, which tends to be a kind of steep straight line, and 0 degrees, and something like 75% of the angle difference between the two. When you hit that slope, you're about 4 to 6 points from the end. So I've started writing a widget in Ubidots that will tell me when I'm at the right point of fermentation, regardless of what the gravity specifically says, which well, I could use for that purpose.
BrewPilot has a useful function that there's a sort of indicator color as it shows you the final gravity. Well, the gravity as is. If it hasn't changed for X number of hours, then it's green. So it has that actual useful thing of saying whether anything's changed over X number of hours.
Yeah.
So you get it's initially the color is red when you first start to ferment, then it goes orange as it slows down, and when it gets to green, it's put in it has it built into the software that there's a parameter that we haven't seen any changes over X amount of time, therefore it's finished, which is quite a nice little feature on BrewPilot, that it actually says it's done. You know.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that's useful.
It's quite neat. And you can set up any of those parameters to tell you anything, you know, like it's changed over this amount over X amount of time or whatever.
Nice.
I've got to go.
I think the bottom line is, I think for, what is it, 30 quid? Is it 30 quid or something you can buy one of these for? I think for that, it's for a lot of people, it's worth a punt. Not a lot to lose.
Yeah, it's much better value than the tilts.
Yeah, and you can actually with them, because it's all open source and so on, you can go into the software and change parameters. I mean, recently someone was complaining about I think it was with BrewPilot, that the temperature on the graph was only set to something like 30 or 40 degrees. And someone said, well, what about Kveik yeasts? And someone said, well, you just go into the settings and change the parameter, you know, up the temperature sensor or whatever. So it's you can mess around with it.
I think that's quite key if you're going to be using something. Having a proprietary product means you can't fiddle. And given that homebrewing to a greater or lesser extent may involve adjusting parameters, it seems a good fit. I've got to go now, so I just want to thank David. I think that was a very good presentation despite the technical difficulties. And I'm off for my breakfast, and I wish you all well.
Cheers, Peter.
See you, Peter.
Cheers, Peter.
Cheers, mate. Good
Bye.
stuff.
Cheers.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my point of view, I went down the Tilt Road, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago when they first came out. And to be fair, I'm now on version 3. The first 2 versions had battery and software issues, but they replaced them free of charge. Version 3 is now the one where I think they replaced it 18 months ago, and I've not had to replace the battery yet. It goes on forever, and I've had no issues with this one. I love the tinkering aspect of things, but I guess circuit boards and stuff is something I don't want to go down, and neither is programming. So I have a tilt. I have an old iPhone 5 that a family member donated, and it goes straight into Google Sheets. And you can alter every parameter in there, temperature of the brews. Obviously, you can't. I can't then bring it together to control solenoid valves, but I couldn't anyway, to be fair. But all to say that if you want to spend a bit more, I guess maybe 100 quid in a sale rather than 35 quid or whatever, that you can end up in the same place, but with no soldering, or, you know, for those of us. And I do now feel very much in minority for those of us who are not, you know.
Yeah, no, it's worth saying that my first iSpindel was the middle ground. I bought it pre-built. I watched a YouTube video to calibrate it in different gravity syrups, and that was it. I learned that Ubidots was a Internet of Things dashboard site that was already coded into the spindle, so I didn't have to, so there is an off the shelf kind of version that doesn't involve downloading any code, configuring anything. You just connect it to your home Wi-Fi, put in your Ubidots password, and you're good to go.
Yeah. So I guess in that respect, apart from the slightly more complicated calibration, or more time consuming, that in that respect they're quite similar.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Well, I use mine inside a corny keg, which is inside a fridge as a fermentation chamber, and then I've got a Nautilus repeater. Then I've mounted in this thing, and which I've got magnets on the back, which sticks to the side of the fridge, so I can watch that when I walk by it in the garage, and then that sends all the information to BrewSpy, which you can watch anywhere. And it's I don't take it as the absolute value, but certainly as has been said earlier, you can see basically when it's fermented out and when it's static. And that's really what I use it for. But obviously, there's a lot more you could use it for. But and because I've seen people saying that there's issues, possible issues with it being inside stainless and inside a chamber. But I think with that Nautilus repeater, it works fine as long as you've got the Wi-Fi signal as well, of course.
Yeah.
So there's no issue of using them in like grain-father conical.
I have one running in a grain father and one running in an SS Brewtech inside fridges. So it's got to get through that and then through the fridge, and they still work.
Okay.
So sorry, one's a Blickman. Yeah, sorry, but I've got them running through stainless steel with. I mean, if you look on some of the forums and so on, you find all sorts of information about people who've said, "Oh, my stainless conical's creating a Faraday cage," and there are ways of dealing with that. It might be just a couple of bits of electrical tape in the right places on where the clasps go or something.
Okay.
But if you're within a meter or two, and if you've got one of those Nautilus, or even the one that Peter was showing earlier on, the cheap version of it, which is a do-it-yourself version, then it should work. I mean, I've had no problems with signal.
Okay. Mind you, I've got to get Wi-Fi to the shed first.
But then use one of those plug-in things.
Power line
going to the mains.
They're fine. You don't need a lot of bandwidth. You just need it's literally, it sends like a JSON payload. It's about 200 characters. It's nothing.
Yeah, it's a tiny amount. It just needs a signal.
And what is the Nautilus thing, Mark, that you've got, that you were showing, that everyone's, a few people have mentioned? Is it like a screen that shows?
Yeah, it was what David showed on his presentation. So it basically is just I put this inside another box, but basically you've got the screen there, which gives you the display of gravity and temperature and battery and all that sort of stuff. But like you said, the beauty of it is you haven't got to go into an app or whatever. And if it's in a place where you're walking by it all the time, which it kind of is for me, then you can just glance at it and you just see it in real time.
Okay, so it's like a clock or something.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, it's basically another one of those. It's another little one of those boards. It's another Wemos board.
What is that?
So what you've got is it's acting as an access point. So all of these devices are talking. So you've got your iSpindel, which has got one of these boards in it, talking to the repeater or that thing, which can then display whatever it's the data that's coming through it, or it can and then that can pass it on to your wireless, to your network. So that it's basically your Internet of Things. They're all connected up. So one's linked to the other. It's then linking to your, if you wanted to, it's linking to your home network, or it's linking to Ubidots or another service or whatever.
I was laughing.
So they're all basically
by the pool, basically.
It's all the same little board, all in the same. They're all in these devices. It has the same thing. So they're all talking to each other.
I pause on this photo. I pause on this photo because you can see this guy's used a stainless steel nut and 5 washers to.
He's a 5-washer guy.
I'll stop sharing now.
The guy who makes them is
overshared, David.
Yeah, the guy who makes them is in Croatia. So that's where mine came from.
All right.
Very nice.
That was his garden, I think, Steve.
Oh, was it? It reminded me of the shots of Ian Cozier's garden, of course.
With a pool?
Well, no, with the fucking Pyrenees in the background.
Oh, that.
Oh, that.
You know, the Alps and shit.
It's amazing those backgrounds you can get on Zoom.
It cost him a fortune, I'm sure. Sorry.
I'm going to have to go, guys. It's been fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. It was brilliant.
Yeah, thank you.
Really, really good.